Hi guys, it's me, Mrs. Snook. So today I'm going to be talking about the major battles as well as the major generals involved in the Civil War. So I'm going to review a little bit from what we talked about last time, and then this is going to be kind of a longer video. Make sure you take notes as we go, since I'm talking about all the major battles as well as generals, and you can use these notes on your quiz or your test. And so let's talk about the Civil War. Okay, so hopefully you watched the lecture that I taped earlier this week about the long-term versus the short-term causes of the Civil War. And I'm hoping that you're remembering that there's three major long-term causes of the Civil War, right? Three major long-term causes, which I talked about in the last lecture, were political, economic, social. And ultimately, whenever you're talking about an event, you usually talk about the political, the economic, the social issues that led to the event. Okay? Now, the political issue, remember, was about the fight between the North and the South over power. The South believed in states' rights. The North thought that the national government was supreme. The economic issue was really about how they made money, whereas the North is all about manufacturing, and most people had a factory job, compared to the fact that the South, okay, most people are farmers, but they grow, many of them, grow cash crops, so tobacco, cotton, not things that you can actually eat, in a wartime situation. And of course, many people in the South, they are too lazy, too cheap, basically, to hire laborers, and so they force slaves to do their labor, which brings us to the social cause, the biggest cause of the Civil War, right, which is slavery. And if you ask the average American in 1860 why the Civil War began, they would tell you it's because of slavery. Okay, there was no doubt, no question about that whatsoever. Yes, the economy was very different, and there was this growing sense of sectionalism and loyalty to one sense of the country. And yes, there was a power struggle, but there had been a power struggle going all the way back to the 1820s when Andrew Jackson had been president, and there was something called the nullification crisis. Now, in the short term, okay, meaning more of the recent events that led to the Civil War. Okay, so this was more like 1820 to 1860. And if you remember in the last lecture, I talked about how this was about power, and the North thought that they were supreme, or really the national government was supreme, and the South was all about states' rights. Feel free, as you guys watch these, if you can't read my handwriting in comments, to send me a message. And not all of our notes will be handwritten like that, like the notes last time. Sometimes they'll be typed. But we did these outside today, and so to do them outside, I just write on a whiteboard. And then, of course, economic, we said it was all about the North. We had factories. And the South was all about farming, right? Most people were small-time farmers with not a lot of money, but there were large plantations which employed many, many slaves as they grew cash crops like cotton and tobacco. Now let's talk about the short-term causes of the Civil War. So as we talk about more of the events that led to the Civil War, really from about 1850 to 1860. Okay, so what was really happening in those 10 years before the war, which is going to lead us to the war. Okay, a little bit closer, maybe you guys can see better. Okay, and really, even though I say we're going to focus on 1850 to 1860, I have to back up the train to 1820. Okay. In 1820, there was this Missouri Compromise passed. And I'm hoping that right now you're thinking to yourself, ooh, Missouri Compromise, I've heard about that from someone before. Yes, you did, in the Ed Puzzle, okay? Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state. That made people in Congress upset because it was going to upset the balance of power. Up until that point, there was an equal number of slave to free states. Now, luckily, Missouri, as it was going to enter as a slave state, Maine at the same time decided to enter the country as a free state. So yet again, there was going to be a balance. But Americans said to themselves, every time a new state wants to enter the Union, there's going to be this big debate. We don't want that. It's time-consuming. It's confusing. We need a permanent solution. So the Missouri Compromise literally took the country and it split it in half, okay, at the 3630 parallel. So if you're looking at a map of the United States, they literally drew a line above Missouri, okay? And anyone who lived above the line in the north was going to be free. Okay? There were instances where people still owned a few slaves, but in general, all the new states that would be formed in the future could not have slavery. In the South, okay, this would be your slave states. And you have to remember, in 1820, there's people living in Illinois and Illinois as a state and up into like Indiana. But as you cross the Mississippi River, that's considered like the West at this point. So Iowa, there's people settling in, but like Kansas and Nebraska doesn't have people yet. None of that has been explored or is really a state. Yes, people live there, and of course Native Americans live there, and they have going back to the days of Louisiana Purchase in 1803. But in general, that's the wild, wild West yet, and there are people, there are residents, there are territories, but it is not a state. So we fast forward in time, and all of this worked for 30 years until we get to 1850. And in 1850, the problem was California. Okay? California wanted to enter the United States, and it wants to enter as a free state. Well, California, okay, you think about its fun shape here. I'm not an art teacher. This is why I'm not DeGarmo or Windish. California was going to go through that little line. So California had a choice. It could have split up, I guess, into Northern and Southern California. It became two states. And above the line, people could have been a free state with no slaves, and below the line is a slave state. But that's not what California wanted. They ultimately wanted to be one state together, join the Union, and they wanted to be, this free state. They already had a long history, and they'd been independent, and they fought and got their freedom from Mexico, and this is what they wanted. Well, this is going to violate the Missouri Compromise. And so it goes to Congress. And the South basically says, the southern states who are in Congress say, fine, California can violate the Missouri Compromise, in a sense repeal it or get rid of it. But if it's going to be allowed to enter as a free state, what do we get in return? Well, what they got in return was they got something called the Fugitive Slave Act. So California will enter the Union as a free state, and the Fugitive Slave Act is going to be passed. And this is all part of something together, which is called the Compromise of 1850, because it is a compromise. California is getting something out of the deal, and at the same time, now the South is going to get something out of the deal. What the Fugitive Slave Act says, it says that all Americans now are sheriffs, are basically police officers in a sense. And they have to go around the country, and if they believe that someone is an escaped slave, they need to turn them in. And if they don't, they're going to face basically criminal charges, they're going to be fined, etc. So this makes people who used to help in the Underground Railroad very nervous, very worried about the charges that they're going to be facing since they're much steeper now. It also made it possible for many people who, were freed blacks who'd been freed upon, their master's death. People now started accusing them of being escaped slaves and saying they, faked their papers and such, and perhaps they were going to get sold back into slavery. So people in the North hate the Fugitive Slave Act. It builds up tensions. And they're not sure if getting California as a free state was really worth it. There were a few other components of the Compromise of 1850, but that's really the heart of it. And these tensions continue to build. The other thing that happens in the short term, right, is Kansas-Nebraska Act. And this was all from this Ed puzzle that you watched the other day. Now, when it comes to our move this down just a little bit closer. I know my handwriting stinks, guys, so feel free, like I'm serious, in comments to ask me what I'm talking about. Kansas and Nebraska, okay? As people moved further west, they wanted to settle Kansas, Nebraska, and turn it into a state, specifically because a senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas wanted to build a railroad across the country, a transcontinental railroad. He wanted to go through Chicago. Chicago was a big manufacturing center. They had a lot of meat processing plants. They wanted to sell their beef out west and have it shipped from the west back to Chicago to be processed, vice versa. To be able to build a railroad, you need to take this territory and turn it into a state. Well, as debate and discussion about turning Kansas and Nebraska into a state came to pass, all this territory is north of the Missouri Compromise line. So clearly, it should be more free territory. The South didn't like that. And Stephen Douglas was a people pleaser. He wanted to run for the presidency one day. He actually runs in 1860. He's trying to gain more support and seem like he's sympathetic to the slave idea. So he has this crazy idea. He says in Kansas and Nebraska, it should be something called popular sovereignty. Okay? You know popular, and sovereignty is SOVEREIGNTY. Sovereign just means who's in charge. Popular is basically referring to what is the people's will. So this term, popular sovereignty, means let's have whatever the people want, let's do it. So Stephen Douglas proposed, let's have the people in Kansas and Nebraska vote, and if they want to be free, that territory will be free. If they want to be slave, it'll be slave. It sounds like a fantastic idea, like all democratic and stuff. It is a terrible idea, because what ends up happening is basically by the time we get to 1854, we have almost a mini civil war, the first unofficial battles of the war, and this is called Bleeding Kansas. A bunch of people who are abolitionists, who are anti-slavery, they move to this territory. But a bunch of people who are pro-slavery move to this territory. And they figured, you know what's one way that we'll win and we'll have enough votes to get people to be on our side and pass, what we want? Let's kill the other side. Yeah, it's anarchy. John Brown and other abolitionists are attacking, they kill people, there's violence back and forth, and this is just a foreshadowing that America is on the brink of a disaster. Now, the president during this time period is Franklin Pierce, and unfortunately, he's got a lot of emotional drama. His child died in this terrible train accident, he was an alcoholic, and he basically just lets it all play out, hoping that somehow magically it won't lead to problems, but it does. It just gets getting worse and worse. Ed Puzzle also talked about how, as we get to 1859, John Brown, that abolitionist I mentioned, he attacks Harper's Ferry because there's an arsenal there. He's trying to steal guns. He's trying to give them to slaves. So they rise up against their masters and kill them in their bed. And yet again, this makes Southerners angry. And this makes Northerners realize how bad things are in America, how we're falling apart. And there's also the release of this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin during this time period, which really is a fictional book, but it shows how bad the life is for slaves. And so some people are starting to say more than ever before, we need slavery to really come to an end. Now I'm going to move into talking about the key people and the key battles. Like I said, this is kind of a long one today, just because I'm kind of reviewing stuff from last lecture. Hopefully you watched it, but I don't know, we reviewed kind of in class today because a lot of kids hadn't. It's going to take a lot of getting used to this, remote learning in class. You have to watch the lectures and take notes still and kind of really take charge of your own learning this year. And we kind of reviewed the Ed Puzzle too, because normally we would have watched that in class, but we were remote and talked about it in class. So let's talk about the key people. So as far as, I'll start with leaders. Okay. So 1856 to 1860, okay, those last 4 years before the war starts, the U.S. president is a man by the name of Buchanan. I think it's James Buchanan specifically. James Buchanan is not a well-liked, that's B-U-C-H-A-N-A-N, I believe. James Buchanan is not a well-liked American president. He had not spent a lot of time in America prior to the war. He'd actually traveled abroad. And so part of the reason why he got elected was because he didn't really have a whole lot to say about slavery or about the abolitionist movement because he'd been in Europe. That was kind of an easy cop-out. So while he's in office, all of his drama is unfolding with John Brown and tensions are increasing. And the Supreme Court, I didn't mention them before, they passed this infamous ruling called Dred Scott versus Sanford, where they basically say that it's not truly legal to have free states, and that slavery should be allowed anywhere, and that slaves have no rights, and that freed blacks aren't truly free. And it's an incredibly racist testimony by Chief Justice Taney. And it just shows how messed up America really is, and how there are many people who support slavery, even at the government, inside the government at this very time. Buchanan just kind of lets it all play out, because perhaps he's thinking about being reelected, but as things start to get out of control, he decides to not run for reelection. So once we get to the election of 1860, okay, so that's 1856 to 1860. In 1860, the man who gets elected, of course, is President Abraham Lincoln. Good old honest Abe. Land of Lincoln, right? From Springfield, Illinois. Was a lawyer, married to Mary Todd, had multiple kids. One of their children dies while he's in the White House. It's really going to upset him. And Lincoln was not a career politician. He spent, obviously growing up, in a log cabin and farming and fishing and hunting, self-taught, self-educated, becomes a lawyer, works in Springfield, works to improve America, believes slavery is morally wrong against its Christian viewpoints. There are other Christians out there who use the Bible to support that slavery is okay and that you're helping the people and that they're underprivileged. It's crazy talk. Now, Lincoln is a member of the newly created Republican Party. And this is the same Republican Party that exists to this day. The Republican Party was formed because they're made up of people who are called free soilers, who want the land out west to be cheaply sold. They're also made up of people who are anti-slavery, who are abolitionists. Now, when Lincoln runs for the presidency, he specifically says, I'm not planning on ending slavery in the South. He only wants to end slavery in the new territories. So there are people who live in New Mexico, for example, but that is not its own state yet. He does not want New Mexico to have the ability to become a slave state. But Southerners were very worried, and they said, if he's going to stop the spread of it, he's going to come in the South and take our guns and take our slaves and take our land. They were very worried for the most part. And so ultimately, when it came to this election in 1860, Lincoln didn't have a prayer in the South. Most Southerners at this point were Democrats. It is the same Democratic Party as today. The Democratic symbol is usually related to the donkey. The Republican symbol is usually the elephant. It goes back to some of the political cartoons back in the day that were posted about each party. And they didn't even have Lincoln on the ballot. It was a guy by the name of Breckinridge and Bell. And when it came to the popular vote, and the people voted in November, they were voting for Breckinridge or Bell. Most people, of course, in the North voted for Lincoln, and some of them voted for Stephen Douglas, that senator from Illinois. Now, overwhelmingly, remember, even though Lincoln won the popular vote, it's not the popular vote that elects the president. If you think back, you probably know this, it's the Electoral College that elects the president. So the election happens here in November. The Electoral College elects Lincoln officially in December. And come January, people in the South are freaked out because they say to themselves, how can this man, who didn't even appear on our ballots, have won the presidency? We don't accept him as our president. He should have been on their ballot. They chose not to include him because they were afraid that he would end slavery. And so at this point in time, the South decides to secede. The first state to secede or leave the Union is South Carolina. Eventually, 7 states will secede, and then in the upcoming months, 11 states will secede and to create a whole new country called the Confederacy or the Confederate States of America. Now, their leader, is a guy by the name of Jefferson Davis. And he is president of the Confederacy. They call it the Confederacy because it's the idea that you share power between the states. They're not all powerful, right? They want it to be all about states' rights here. But Jefferson Davis is their elected leader. They meet in Richmond, Virginia. They decide that's the capital. And they have to come up with a game plan, a strategy right away. And they're thinking to themselves, okay, their advantages, most of their boys know how to hunt and fish and camp and ride horses. They have excellent generals on their hand, like General Lee. Plus, their biggest advantage is they only have to fight a defensive war. They just have to protect their new country, okay? If they want to really prove that they are the true winners, they can go north up to Washington, D.C. and capture Lincoln and capture the capital to win. But otherwise, they're good to go. Disadvantages, of course, is they don't have a true army. They've got to create a navy. They don't have any relations with other countries. It's a problem. Now, let's talk about, and as this is happening, right, and as the Confederacy is leaving, okay, what's happening? Well, James Buchanan is still president. Back then, the president didn't take office until March. So Buchanan loses the election officially in the Electoral College in December, yet Lincoln does not become president until March. And that's why a lot of people rate Buchanan lowly and say that he was not a great president, because they say, dude, for 3 months, you're just sitting on your heels, on your hands, doing nothing, and you're letting the South leave and create this whole other country. And a lot of people blame him for it. And Lincoln, basically, as he comes into office in March, he walks into this mess. Now let's talk about generals, okay? We've got a couple of major generals to talk about. The first one is the general for the South, or the Confederacy, or Confederate States of America. We've got Robert E. Lee. If you've ever watched Dukes of Hazzard or any show like that, you've probably heard of him before. He's been to West Point. He's an excellent trained. He's a fighter, a commander, has great strategies and skills. He actually did not want to fight. He said that, this war was going to tear America apart. You had family members who lived in different states who were going to be on different sides of the war. He did not want to fight. He eventually fights because he loves Virginia, not because he wants to fight a war. Now for the North, or the Union, we're talking about our blue here versus our gray. For the North, their main general, so this is the guy who's in charge of everything. In the beginning is a guy by the name of, I think his first name is Robert as well. Maybe it's James. I don't know. I'm having a hard time with first names today. It's Robert McClellan. McClellan. Yet again, excellent trained, lots of strategy, experience. But he's overly cautious, and he's always afraid to do anything because he's afraid it's the wrong choice. And it's this anxiety and afraid to act, which is going to lead to problems. And we're going to lose the first 2 years of the war. We're going to win a few battles, but we're going to lose a lot. Eventually, he is going to be fired by President Lincoln. They disagree because McClellan did not continue to advance against the South. And so he's eventually replaced, and the overall commander eventually becomes Ulysses S. Grant. Okay? Ulyses S. Grant. I think the S stands for Simpson, I think. He eventually, is chosen because he had won at the Battle of Vicksburg. He had had all these successes as a general, was outspoken and had great success and great strategies and leadership. Was also very shy at times, yet at the same time kind of a partier, honestly. And because of these victories, he gets along with Lincoln, and he gets promoted and becomes the top U.S. general and leads us to victory. He eventually goes on to become president, 3 presidents after Lincoln is out of office. Now, as the war is beginning, we're going to see that when you're thinking about the advantages of the Union, well, of course, they already have an army, they already have a navy, they have connections with others, but in terms of disadvantage, since a lot of their kids live in the cities, they don't necessarily know how to ride a horse or shoot a gun or hunt or fish, can be out on their own. And at the same time, Robert McClellan is just kind of more disorganized, he's too cautious, they don't have great battle strategy. Clearly, Lee is the better general. And also, they have to fight this offensive war to make the South come back. So it's not going to be easy because the South is going to fight to the death because those soldiers know that if they are caught, they're going to probably be accused of treason and go to jail. Okay? Now let's talk about the last 5 major battles, and then we're done. I know this is super long today, guys. Sorry. I don't think I reviewed quite as much in class with the other kids, or I didn't write it all down. I don't know. I felt like you guys might need more instruction, though, because you're remote. You can't ask me questions. You can always ask me questions, but you know what I mean? It's not the same. Okay. Let's talk about the 5 major battles here. The Civil War goes from 1860 when it starts, really 61, the fighting begins, to 1865. There's tons of battles. We're going to talk about the 5 major ones. Okay, first one is the Battle of Fort. It's not quite dry yet. I know it's a little guy whiteboard, but I already have stuff written on my other whiteboard. So yeah. Fort Sumter. That's S-U-M-T-E-R. What happens at Fort Sumter, and I'm going to kind of do each battle, and then I'll tell you the significance of why it's important, and then I'll go into who won. The Battle of Fort Sumter is significant because it's the first shots fired. Okay? Now, I'm going to pause for a second, I think. There's announcements. All right, so I'm back. I just hit pause. We had some announcements at the end of the school day. So I've got down the 5 major battles here. So Fort Sumter, and like I said, for each battle, I'm just going to tell you why it's significant and who won. So for Fort Sumter, it is significant because this is the first shots fired. Okay? What ends up happening is that Fort Sumter is South Carolina territory. And this is a U.S. Army base. There's an arsenal. There's lots of weapons. There's soldiers there. Well, now that South Carolina is in a different country, the Confederacy shows up and basically says, these men can join the Confederacy or they're all prisoners of war, and these weapons are all ours now. And they want them because they don't have a lot of guns. The South is not about manufacturing. They only had like big cities and factories in like Raleigh and Atlanta and maybe Charleston, and very few railroads to move troops or supplies and stuff. Everything was done by boat, along the coast or along the Mississippi River. So they attack and they start shooting, and the guys are surrounded inside the fort and they're starving. And they send telegrams. Major Anderson sends telegrams to Lincoln, and Lincoln's like, what do I do? And he sends food, but he doesn't send any supplies. All right, so he sends food and some supplies, but not like soldiers to fight. The reason being is when Lincoln took office in 1860, in his inaugural address, he promised no more bloodshed, or no bloodshed at all, really. Because there hadn't really been fighting yet, but he just said, I don't want people to die over this. I want to talk this out. And now the South is striking first, and he doesn't know what to do. Maybe he was too cautious. Maybe he was afraid of going back on that promise, but honestly, I think it was a political move. He wanted to paint the South as a bad guy, and that way the South attacks, the men are starting to starve, they eventually surrender, and they take the fort, and so naturally this is where the South wins. Okay, I'm just going to put S wins. And he wanted the South to win because it makes the North look good. He can put this in the newspapers, and he can boost up morale. He can get some people who were not sure about fighting to support this war. It gets people to volunteer. Eventually there's a draft, or what we call conscription, but at least in the beginning, there's a lot of support for this war. You can't let those men die in vain. Now for the next 2 years, that's 1861, April, till 1863, there's a lot of battles. Some northern victories, a lot of northern losses, because they're fighting that offensive war and because Lee is a better general. Now, the next major battle to talk about is Antietam. Antietam is important. The significance is it has the most single-day casualties. The most single-day casualties. So this is considered like one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Not like some battles obviously go on for not just one day. They go on for days and weeks, right? But for one day, if we're talking about just one day in particular, there's more people that die in this one day than there are in many other battles of the war. Now, who ends up winning this battle? The North wins this battle. Specifically, in the Battle of Antietam, 22,000 people died in this battle. And so, ultimately, I can hit pause. Okay, sorry, I had a student. So, for Antietam, there's more single-day casualties in that one day. Specifically, 22,000 people die in that one day. There's like 700,000 people who die in the Civil War overall, which is more than, Vietnam War combined with Vietnam War combined with Korean War combined with World War I, World War II, American Revolution. More people die in the Civil War. It's terribly bloody. People are dying from infection, from battle wounds, lack of medication. They're getting operated on without any kind of anesthesia. It's awful. Women are being nurses. Some are even dressing as men so they can fight. It's craziness. So more people die in this one day, and the North wins, but it's kind of like, is it really a win when that many people die, in a battle? Now, after this battle, this is when Lincoln and McClellan get in the fight, because Lincoln says to McClellan, you won. Okay, this is fought in Maryland. And he says, why didn't you push further back? Maryland is a border state, okay, so it's part of the Union. But he says, why didn't you push into Virginia? You had him going. You had him on the run. You could have forced Lee to potentially surrender. They fight about this. They fight over McClellan being too cautious, and he fires McClellan. And then eventually he's going to be replacing him with, like I said, with General Grant. McClellan is going to hate Lincoln so much that he eventually runs against him for the presidency in 1864. Now, despite the fact that there is some fighting between McClellan and Lincoln, this is considered a victory overall. And immediately after the battle, this is when Lincoln passes the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay? Emancipation. Emancipation Proclamation. To emancipate means to free. So basically what this proclamation means is this is when Lincoln frees the slaves. And a lot of people, when you did your KWL chart last week, you might have thought to yourself, oh, Lincoln freed the slaves. He did free the slaves, but here's the trick. He only freed the slaves in the South. So he frees slaves in like Alabama and South Carolina, where he has no actual power to free them. The reason he did that was now they can legally, supposedly, escape from their masters, go to the North, and join to become soldiers. And we will start to see black regiments. But the U.S. government is still pretty racist. They don't pay them the same. They won't let you let black officers. If you watch the movie Glory, they show some of the cool fighting there with black regiments. So when people claim Lincoln freed the slaves, yes and no. He did not free any slaves in the North. There were still slaves in the North, like in Missouri, and he does not want to make those border states mad, so he does not by any means take away their slaves. Now, as the war continues, we still have now switching of kind of power. General Grant has some victories at Vicksburg. He becomes in charge of the Union, and we're starting to see the tide of the war change, which gets us to Gettysburg. Gettysburg is the turning point of the war, kind of like your climax if you're thinking about it in English class. General Lee had his men go north, up to Philadelphia. Or not to Philadelphia, to Pennsylvania. It's not quite near Philadelphia, honestly, at all. And I haven't been to Gettysburg since I was like 14, but I don't think it was near Philadelphia. I think it was closer to Pittsburgh, if anything. This is the turning point because he sends them there. They're looking for shoes. They're wearing, their uniforms. They're falling apart. They don't have enough food or supplies. They're trying to get shoes, and then eventually they're hoping to get to D.C., to capture it, to capture Lincoln, and perhaps to take over some northern cities if they can for food and supplies and to show the world their power. Maybe then they can get some support from England. Because at this point, they're kind of, on their own. They're looking for constant support. This battle goes on for 3 days. It is devastating losses. We're going to see the death of Stonewall Jackson and some other key generals. Ultimately, the North is going to be willing to make sacrifices and have huge casualties. And so the North wins. The reason this is kind of the turning point in the war is because after this point, the South will never have enough soldiers to fight that offensive war. They will never have enough troops. So many men die that they will never be able to take over a northern city or capture D.C. or capture Lincoln, per se. So now they're just kind of stuck on their own trying to defend the South. Now, you're also going to be reading page 135 and doing 1 and 2 on that workbook organizer page. And this is when the Gettysburg Address is written. And the Gettysburg Address was basically just like a funeral statement that Lincoln says at the cemetery, talking about how 7 years ago, that's when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And America was a new country, and we were all about liberty and equality and freedom. And we're not going to let these men who died here die in vain. We're going to work for a better life. Now, almost done. Next battle is the March to Atlanta. What happens in the March to Atlanta is that General Sherman, S-H-E-R-M-A-N, General Sherman burns the city of Atlanta. The reason he burned the city of Atlanta was because it was one of the manufacturing centers. He also wants to have make sure that people are, not able to escape at all. Part of Lincoln's plan to win against the South is called the Anaconda Plan. And it was the idea that you're going to take control of the Mississippi River to make sure they can't move supplies or troops, which they've already done. That's what happened at Vicksburg. It's also all about blockading the ports to make sure they can't get food or supplies from England or anywhere else. That's done. And then last but not least, it's to conquer Richmond, Virginia, their capital. And you're going to squeeze it like you squeeze a snake. By Sherman burning Atlanta, it's kind of helping shore up that plan and get us closer to the victory for the Union. When Sherman does this, he's using a strategy called total war. Total war means you're willing to attack a kid as well as a soldier. They're not out killing kids, don't get me wrong, but they're burning down people's houses, destroying the food in their fields, killing their morale to fight. This is obviously good again, a northern victory. The North wins. Last but not least, the Anaconda Plan has pretty much worked, right? They divided the Confederacy in two. Texas is split off. That's what happened at Vicksburg. They're stopping any supplies coming in along the East Coast. That's all been kind of isolated, helping from Atlanta. England and no other countries are recognizing them as a free country or coming to help the Confederacy. So last but not least, the goal is to take over Richmond, Virginia. So they force, we'll say it this way, we'll capture and surround Richmond, Virginia, which is their capital, and General Lee and Jefferson Davis, the president, know that they can keep fighting. They're surrounded at this courthouse, and if they keep fighting, it's just going to be loss after loss after loss, and they figure, what's the point? They're surrounded, and so this is when, of course, the North wins and the South surrenders, and the war is over. And when the war ends, Lincoln is very hospitable. He lets the officers keep their horses, their guns. He doesn't treat them as traitors, which is what they are. He doesn't like spit on their flag and like throw them in jail. He just says, go home. We'll talk about a peace treaty later, because he knows we have to all come back together again and work on becoming one united country. And unfortunately, he won't live much longer after this. Lincoln is going to die shortly after, and so it's going to be up to the next president to make a peace treaty to bring the country back together. So I know that was a quick overview. It was a lot of notes, but it was a quick overview. We're going to spend most of the chapter, though, focusing on Reconstruction, putting the country back together. Next time, we're going to talk more about Lincoln and watch a video and talk about his assassination. Have a great day, guys. Email me if you have questions. Get down your vocab, your Edpuzzle, your Flipgrid, your bookwork, and your exit slip. Later.